Konnichiwa minasan. I've spent a total of 150 hours studying Japanese in a classroom. Today I want to share my thoughts around what it's like learning Japanese as a native English speaker, why it's difficult. So I recently passed the first level of my Japanese language course, level 1 of 8. And basically what that means is that I operate around the level of a 2 or 3-year-old, something like a preschooler. So I know about maybe 500 words, 50 verbs. I can walk into a convenience store and I can say no when they ask me for if I want a bag. I can tell them I want to pay by credit card. I can ask people what they're up to today, introduce myself, my nationality, what my hobbies are. Basically very, very basic, minimally conversational at about the level of a 2 or 3-year-old. So with that in mind, I want to talk about my experience. There's one thing that's crystal clear in my mind after 150 hours of study and 300 plus hours of self-study before I even got to Japan. It's that learning Japanese is brutally hard. You heard it here first. Brutally hard. I think the interesting question to ask is, why is it so hard? And it might seem like there's a straightforward answer to this question, but I don't think it's as straightforward as most people think it is. So, how do we go about answering this question? I guess you can start by looking at the elements of the language, drilling into them a little bit, and trying to figure out which parts are hard, which parts are easy, putting them all together, and coming to some sort of conclusion. So that's what I'm going to try and do. Sort of a reverse engineering type deal. So of course, with any language, generally you're going to have some type of writing system. And Japanese instantly makes this a little more difficult than, say, English, because there are 3 different writing systems. So you have hiragana, katakana, and kanji. And to be honest, hiragana and katakana are not particularly difficult in my mind. Hiragana especially, it's quite similar to the English alphabet, where you have sort of a letter that represents a sound phonetically. It's just that you have 46 of them as opposed to 26. And then katakana is very similar to that. It's basically a separate alphabet that is used for non-Japanese foreign words, loan words. So you add to that another 46 sort of letters. Now the tricky part comes in when we start talking about kanji. Kanji are like Chinese characters, sort of like pictograms that have their own meaning. And there are like 10,000 of these things. So one of the first sort of barriers to entry when it comes to learning Japanese is, studying kanji. And I'd say at this point I know around 50 to 100 kanji. And honestly, I don't think, at least so far, that it's, exceptionally difficult. Like many things in this language, I think it boils down to essentially just a memorization exercise. I mean, in the same way that you understand the 26 letters of the alphabet, and you understand that when you combine letters in the alphabet to form words, and you remember what each of those words means, what they look like when those letters are combined, it's a similar type of way that you learn kanji, except that they're sort of more like pictures rather than sequences of letters. Now you do get sequences of pictures that also make up words. And there are many added complications because a single kanji character can have multiple readings. There are two types of readings. There's the kunyomi, which is like the Japanese reading, and the onyomi, which is the Chinese reading. And there can be multiple kunyomi readings and multiple onyomi readings for a single kanji character. So for example, the kanji for day, one of the readings is hi, another one of the readings is nichi, another one of the readings is jutsu, depending if the kanji stands alone or if it's part of a compound word. So admittedly, that is quite tricky because it's like you can study the kanji and you can know one of the readings, then you can see that kanji appear in like a word, and it might not be clear which reading to use, especially if you don't know the reading, which happens to me all the time. So yeah, that's sort of kanji in a nutshell. And in summary, the writing system in Japanese is actually composed of 3 writing systems. Personally, I don't think that it's exceptionally difficult to learn. And I don't think this should be a barrier for a motivated learner, sufficiently motivated learner to, to prevent them from learning Japanese. So next up we have grammar. I do find grammar in Japanese to be quite difficult, but again, like not exceptionally difficult. In fact, I need to clarify what I mean by difficult, because I don't think the grammar structures and the sentence structures in the language are conceptually difficult. Rather, I think they're actually quite easy to understand. For example, if you want to say item 1 or item 2, which one do you like more? You'd say, for example, apples or oranges, which one do you like more? Ringo to mikan to dochira no hou ga suki desu ka? So the structure is item 1 to, item 2 to, dochira no hou ga suki desu ka? Not particularly hard to understand at a conceptual level. Similarly, if you want to say, give your opinion about something, using the verb to think, omoi. For example, item 1 is adjective 1, to omoimasu. So if I'm gonna say it, I think Japanese people are very respectful. I would say Nihonjin. How do I say it? Nihonjin wa hito ga shinsetsu to omoimasu. And so on and so forth. Like, you just have a bunch of these structures that you need to memorize, and they're not difficult to understand. So again, to me, it boils down to memorization exercise. And of course, you know, there's a difference between speaking it, reading it, and writing it. But I think the same thing applies. If we move on to verb conjugation, yeah, I mean, it's another one of those things that, again, I don't think it's particularly difficult. It's sort of the verbs follow the verbs are conjugated in sort of very systematic ways. There are only two irregular verbs in Japanese, suru and kuru, and all the other verbs, as far as I know, are basically conjugated in the same way. If you compare that to English, you have like 50 or 100 or 200 irregular verbs. It's just full of oddly conjugated verbs, which makes it way more difficult, in my mind. So for example, taking the verb to go, one of the verb forms, the casual form, is iku. The polite form, for example, is ikimasu. The Thai form, which would be like I want to go, is ikitai. The Nai form, which is like I don't want to go, is ikanai. The te form, which is the form you use when you're, for example, connecting two verbs. Ite tabemasu, which would be like I went and then I ate. So the te form would be ite. And there are admittedly quite a few different forms. I've only studied like 5 of them, the ones I just mentioned. There are, I don't know how many more, 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 more. But as far as I know, they're pretty consistent in terms of how they're conjugated. You do have essentially 3 groups. They're categorized into 3 groups. So you have group 1, which are all conjugated the same way. Group 2, which follow slightly different rules around the conjugation, but they're all conjugated the same way. And then the 2 irregular verbs. So again, like, people have invented songs to remember how to conjugate these things. And I know I'm beginning to sound like a broken record, but it does just feel like a memorization exercise once again. Okay, so verbs. I think you know, reasonably challenging, but definitely not something that would discourage a motivated learner. You just grind through it. Once you have it committed to memory, you've got it. And that's that. Now, still within grammar, talking about sentence structure. This one I feel is one of the elements that does make Japanese particularly difficult. So Japanese follows what's called a subject-object-verb order, whereas English follows a subject-verb-object order. Subject-verb-object order. So for example, in English you would say, I go to school. In Japanese you would say, I school go. And that, my friends, confuses the brain mightily. In terms of speaking the language and thinking like a Japanese person, I'd say this is one of the most difficult things to wrap my head around. Because my brain is so strongly calibrated and has decades of reinforced learning in the English subject verb object paradigm, it does make it quite difficult to think in Japanese, and translating between the two is generally how my internal monologue works when I'm trying to figure out how to say something. Whereas I think what needs to happen is I basically need to build a Japanese brain and build out the model so that it's automatic at a subconscious level. And that's one of the things I'm finding is taking quite a while, even after hundreds of hours of looking at anime, listening to Japanese music, like practicing with natives. I'm still not even close to getting there. It feels like it'll take quite a while, but I'm hoping that one day it sort of just clicks. One thing I forgot to mention about my progress is that I can say sort of very basic sentences, but stringing together a more complicated sentence is quite challenging at the moment. The funny part about that is that, like, I'll walk into a store or I'll have a conversation with someone and they'll get the perception that this guy's really good at Japanese because I'll like say a few basic sentences and they'll be like, oh damn, this guy Nihongo ga jouzu desu. And then they'll blast me with a string of native words and I'll have no idea what they're saying. Oh, I think I already walked this way. Okay, I'm gonna turn around. Go a different way. Where did I not go yet? Am I going in circles? This is such a big park. Anyways, yeah, they'll blast me with a whole bunch of Japanese and I'll be like, I'm sorry, I have no idea what you just said. My 3 go-to phrases are Nihongo ga skoshi wakarimasu. Just like, I don't understand. I only understand a little bit of Japanese. Yukuri onagai shimasu. She's like, please go slowly. And mo ichido kudasai. She's like, could you please repeat that? But anyways, what was I talking about? Oh yeah, subject, verb, object. I'll admit that one's tricky, and it's been a challenge for me. Still within the territory, still within the sort of sphere of grammar, Japanese has these sort of markers called particles, and they're notoriously difficult as well. For example, one of the particles is wa, which is sort of like a subject topic marker. So, for example, watashi wa kurisu desu. Wa marks the subject. Watashi, which in this case is I. Tomodachi to aimasu. To is like the particle for with. So like I'm going to meet up with my friends, etc., etc. And it's often, this isn't really a concept that exists in English. Like you do have prepositions and words like a, the, by, etc. But particles are sort of a different structure entirely. And yeah, they're difficult. I'll just leave it at that. Okay. The last thing I want to mention about grammar is the politeness levels, because depending on who you're talking to and what your relationship is with the person, you are expected to use language that corresponds to sort of the power dynamic in the relationship. So for example, you use different verb forms with your friend than you do with an elder, than you do with your boss. Did I already walk here? Maybe not. So for example, the verb to understand. If I'm just chatting with my friend, I can say wakatta. But if I'm chatting with someone who's just an acquaintance or with my teacher or something, I would say wakarimashita. And then if I'm working in a grocery and the customer tells me that they want to pay with a credit card, oh, this is nice, I would say kashikomarimashita, which is sort of like your instruction has been received. So like there's 3 different ways to say I understand, and you have to know which way to say it based on who you're talking to. Like in English, you just go, yep, got it. I got you, I understand. It's more straightforward. So that does make the language tricky because you're having to remember 4 different ways of saying the same thing.
Like Chris is going like, oh no.
Okay. So that's grammar. I would say, summarizing, grammar is quite different. Grammar in Japanese is quite difficult, but again, not exceptionally difficult for the sufficiently motivated speaker. it does have a lot of structures and a lot of paradigm differences when you compare it to English. So it's one thing that you will have to spend a lot of time on to master if you want to gain proficiency in Japanese. Okay, what's next? Vocabulary. Vocabulary is brute force memorization. You can use like flashcards. Most people recommend using what's called an SRS, which is a spaced repetition system, where you review words just before you're about to forget them, and that is the best way to commit them to long-term memory. So that's, again, you're just grinding out and spending a lot of time memorizing vocabulary. I think they say once you memorize like 2,000 words, you're covered around 80% of the language. That's all I want to say about vocabulary. So it's just a grind. If we move to pronunciation and speaking, I will say that phonetically, a lot of the characters are similar to English. So, for example, in Japanese there's a character shi, and in English we have sh. Because we have two separate letters to make up shi, but sh and i. There are just a few cases where the Japanese sound doesn't really map cleanly onto the English sound, like r, hu, 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 ru, and it's just a matter of understanding the differences and working towards being able to pronounce them in such a way that people are able to understand you. I struggle with this a lot. But there are lots of resources to help native English speakers understand why they make pronunciation mistakes, like what the shape of their mouth should be, where their tongue should be, etc. So once you get to reading those and practicing those, you should be fine. At least that's what I'm telling myself. Okay, that was all I wanted to say about pronunciation. Oh yeah, Japanese does have this thing called pitch accent, which I don't want to get into because I don't really know how to explain it, because I don't even hear pitch accent at this point. There's lots of videos that explain it. For example, hana or hanna, one of those is nose and one of those is flower, depending which way the pitch accent goes. Next, listening comprehension. Okay. This one is pretty hard too. But again, you just have to keep practicing. At this point, when I first started, if I would listen to anything at native speed, I could barely make out any of the words, even the words that I knew. Now, after 150 hours of study and lots of hours of listening, I can make out maybe, I don't know, depending on what I'm watching or listening to, maybe 5 to 10% to 25%, maybe 30 to 40% of the words. And then I can start learning new words that way, because I know more of the words than I don't know in some of the sentences. So I start bolting on and learning the new words that way. Um, yeah, again, it's an exposure exercise. The more you're exposed to it, the more your listening gets more finely tuned and calibrated. Okay. Moving on to, or I guess going back to speaking a little bit. Japanese is a very high context language. So a lot of the things are inferred based on what was said previously, or basically just inferred because it's obvious. For example, if I go up to someone and say "gakusei desu," which is student am, they know I'm saying I'm a student, but I don't need to say "watashi wa gakusei desu." It's very highly contextualized in that way. A lot of stuff is just inferred. But it does make it quite tricky because if you don't understand the context, you're not going to understand what's going on at all. So yeah, that was just another aspect of the speaking piece. Okay. Reading and writing. They both have their challenges. But I'd say those have been less difficult for me to gain some level of proficiency in. Like I can write some basic kanji. I can write words that I know in hiragana seamlessly. I will say that katakana is a bit more challenging because it's not used as often, so you get less exposure. So I haven't mastered writing it yet. Reading comprehension, pretty similar. I'd say a bit easier than writing. So recognition versus recall. In my experience, recognition is always easier than recall. So if I'm listening to someone saying something to me, it's easier for me to understand what they're saying. But if I need to formulate a response to what they're saying, I need to recall, how do I say that? And that's sort of akin to writing. That's more difficult. Anyways, I think the last thing that I'd want to mention is mental barriers to learning Japanese. One thing that I've found is that learning the language takes quite a toll mentally and can become mentally exhausting. Like, it can take a lot of brain power, for example, just to read a single word that I haven't seen before, or that I haven't seen in a long time, and then just to remember the meaning of that word. So I will say the mind does, at least my mind, does like to take the path. Wow, that's really nice. My mind likes to take the path of least resistance. So for example, if there's signs and they have the Japanese writing in kanji or hiragana or katakana, and then they have the English writing written below, my mind will automatically jump to the English writing. And I'll have to consciously stop it and say, no, we need to focus on what the Japanese says and we need to practice. We need to read that instead. And yeah, I can like read the English in 1 second and I can get stuck on the Japanese for like 30 seconds or a minute. So there is an element of mental exhaustion, mental fatigue, and I would actually say that is one of the most challenging parts of learning the language. You know, not the actual language elements, but the mental battle, having the mental toughness and the mental discipline to stick with it and be consistent and keep your motivation high. That can be challenging, and it's like that with anything, right? I think that's just a general rule for life, that if something's hard, even if you're motivated, you're going to have to find some way to stay consistent and to stay disciplined. And whether that be by, setting goals, talking to your friends and family about what you hope to achieve, journaling, sort of developing ways to keep that discipline and that motivation is important. Building habits into your life that incorporate learning as part of your lifestyle is important. For example, every day in the morning I wake up and I review kanji. I review the kanji in the SRS application that I'm using to learn kanji every morning and every night before I go to bed. And now I'm at a point where it's just automatic and I feel like something's missing if I haven't reviewed it. So yeah, that was a very long, rambly, sort of high-level brain dump. Pulling it all together, if I had to summarize, like, why is Japanese so difficult? I would say there are certain elements of the language that are counterintuitive to a native English speaker, that are going to be generally more difficult to learn and understand when you have a mind that's modeled and calibrated to the English language. For example, the fact that the language is subject object verb rather than subject verb object. The fact that you have to learn 2,000 kanji, throwing that into the mix, that does make it more difficult. The fact that you have to understand and learn what particles like ha, ga, to, de, o, what these particles mean, when to use them. The fact that you use different verbs based on the level of politeness that's required in the situation. The fact that the language is highly contextual. When you combine all of these elements together, what you get is this product that on the surface does begin to feel insurmountable, I'll admit. But I've already reached the point where I know that it is doable. And it will just take quite a lot of dedication. If I wanted to gain, conversational fluency, I'm probably looking at 1 to 2 years, 1 year at the very least, 2 years for sort of, if I had to guess, medium medium level conversational proficiency and something like 3 to 5 years to really begin to become more advanced. So I will also say that keep those timelines in mind and know yourself. If you're the type of person who is able to stick to a long-term goal because you're passionate about it, then yeah, Japanese could definitely be for you. If you're not that type of person, maybe just dip your toes in the water first and think about it think long and hard about whether this is something you want to undertake in your life, because it will take up a lot of your time and energy. But anyways, I'm going to stop rambling now. Hopefully some of that was somewhat useful to some of the audience. If you've made it this far, you're an absolute star. And I can't thank you enough. So, take care. Mata ne. See you again soon. If you have any questions, comments, inquiries, or concerns, drop a comment in the video. And I will see you all soon. Bye bye.